New York City, April 24th, 1976, 11:47 at night. John Lennon was in the kitchen of his apartment at the Dakota building on Central Park West. He had been baking bread. His son Sean was asleep down the hall. The apartment was quiet. The telephone rang. He picked it up on the second ring. The voice on the other end said, "It's me." It was Paul McCartney. They had not spoken properly in 2 years. The last real conversation had ended badly. Something about lawyers, something about money, something about the things that money does to people who once made music together in a storeroom behind a cinema screen in Hamburg. Lennon didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I know. I saw the show." McCartney had been watching Saturday Night Live. So had Lennon. Lorne Michaels had appeared on screen and offered the Beatles $3,000 to reunite on live television. A joke. But both men had seen it in the same city at the same moment, and it had reminded them of something they had been trying not to think about. McCartney said, "We should have gone." Lennon said, "We should have gone." McCartney drove to the Dakota the next morning. This much is documented. It happened. In 1976, McCartney visited Lennon at the Dakota on several occasions. They drank tea, they watched television, they played guitar occasionally, old songs, the songs they had written before everything got complicated. On this particular morning in April 1976, they sat at Lennon's kitchen table and said the things that had been unsaid for 6 years. McCartney brought a cassette recorder. He said later, "I wanted to remember it. I didn't know then that we would never have another conversation like that one." They talked for 4 hours about Hamburg, about Brian Epstein, about the afternoon in 1957 when someone introduced them in a churchyard in Woolton, and Lennon had watched McCartney play and understood immediately that his band had just got better. About Pete Best, about Stuart Sutcliffe, about the night Lennon played a show in Hamburg hours after hearing that Sutcliffe was dead, about the fight, about how do you sleep, about the things they had said through music that they had been too angry to say directly. McCartney said, "I didn't understand why you had to say it like that." Lennon said, "Because I couldn't say it any other way, and because I knew you'd hear it." At some point in the afternoon, Lennon picked up a guitar. He played a chord, then another, a melody that McCartney had never heard. "What's that?" McCartney asked. "Something I've been working on," Lennon said. "I don't know if it's finished." McCartney said, "Play it." Lennon played the song from beginning to end. It was about two people who had spent years fighting and finally understood that the fighting had always been the way they stayed connected, that the silence after the fighting was harder to bear than the fight itself. When he finished, McCartney didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "That's the one, that's the song." Lennon said, "I know." McCartney said, "We should record it." Lennon said, "Not yet, not like this, not for anyone else." He reached under the kitchen table and pulled out the cassette recorder McCartney had brought. He pressed record. He played the song again. This time McCartney sang the harmony. They had not sung together in 6 years. The harmony was perfect immediately. The way it always had been, the way two voices that have been singing together since they were teenagers find each other without trying. When it ended, both men sat in silence. Lennon said, "Nobody hears this while we're alive." McCartney said, "Agreed." McCartney kept the cassette for 4 years. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot outside the Dakota building. He was 40 years old. McCartney got the call at his farm in Scotland. He walked outside and stood in a field for a long time. 3 weeks later, he retrieved the cassette from wherever he had stored it. He listened to it once. Then he put it in a box and sealed the box. In 1995, during the Anthology project, when the surviving Beatles gathered to work on the final recordings, McCartney brought the box to the session. He set it on the table. He didn't open it. George Harrison asked what was in it. McCartney said, "Something John and I recorded, just us, in 1976. Harrison said, "Are we going to listen to it?" McCartney said, "Not yet." The box went back in storage. In 2003, McCartney had the cassette digitized and the file encrypted. The instructions, witnessed by 2 attorneys, specify that the recording cannot be accessed until January 1st, 2080, 104 years after it was made. The instructions are signed, Paul McCartney. Below that, in a different hand, Lennon's handwriting, transferred from a note he had made in 1976. 4 words, the one that matters. Stop. None of that happened. The Saturday Night Live offer, real. April 24th, 1976. Lorne Michaels, $3,000. Live television. Lennon and McCartney really were in the same city that night. McCartney's visits to the Dakota in 1976. Real. They happened. They drank tea. They watched television. They sometimes played guitar. Everything else. The midnight phone call, the 4-hour conversation, the song, the cassette, the 2080 vault, I invented. All of it. And here is what I want you to sit with. You believed it because the people were real and the emotions were true to who they were. And the story felt like the story that should have happened even if it didn't. That is what myth does. It fills in the gaps with what we need to be true. But here's what I know about John Lennon and Paul McCartney that doesn't require invention. They met in a churchyard in Liverpool at 15 and 14 and spent the next 20 years in each other's orbit, fighting and creating and fighting again. They wrote the most famous songs in popular music history. They never properly said goodbye. When Lennon was killed, McCartney stood in a field in Scotland and couldn't speak. That moment, the real one, the undramatized one, is more extraordinary than any invented vault or sealed cassette. You don't need to make up a story about John Lennon and Paul McCartney. The true story is the one that keeps you up at night. The things unsaid. The phone call that never happened. The song that was never written together. That's the vault. The one that stays sealed forever. The Beatles Files continues. The real stories are next. Subscribe. And if you haven't watched the full Beatles story yet, start there. It's worth your time.